The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Atlanta Municipal Court as Samuel Richardson made his way through the security checkpoint. At 78 years old, his movements were deliberate but dignified, his worn brown leather briefcase clutched firmly in his weathered hands. The security guards watched as he carefully placed his belongings in the plastic bin, his aged but well-maintained suit jacket folded neatly beside them. "Good morning," Samuel nodded to the young security guard who handed him back his belongings. His voice was warm and measured, carrying the gentle drawl of someone who had spent their entire life in Georgia. The guard barely glanced up, already focused on the next person in line. The courthouse hallway was bustling with activity. Lawyers in crisp suits hurrying past with their smartphones pressed to their ears, worried defendants clutching manila folders, and court officers maintaining order in the controlled chaos. Samuel checked his watch, an old Timex that had been with him for decades, and made his way to courtroom 3B. Inside, the wooden benches were already filling up with people waiting for their cases to be called. Samuel found a spot in the third row, setting his briefcase carefully beside him. He pulled out his reading glasses, wiped them clean with a handkerchief, and began reviewing the papers he had brought with him. At the front of the courtroom, Judge William Barrett was already presiding over the morning's cases. At 45, Barrett was known for running an efficient courtroom, sometimes at the expense of patience. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his black robe pristine, and his demeanor carried the confidence of someone who had grown accustomed to wielding authority. As Samuel waited, he observed the proceedings with quiet attention. A young mother pleaded her case about a speeding ticket, a businessman argued about a parking violation, and a teenager struggled to explain why he had run a red light. Judge Barrett handled each case swiftly, his responses growing increasingly curt as the morning wore on. The court clerk, Ms. Peterson, a woman in her mid-30s with rectangular glasses and a perpetually serious expression, called out names from her list with mechanical efficiency. When she reached Samuel Richardson, her voice carried a hint of impatience, as if the mere act of waiting for an elderly man to make his way to the podium was an inconvenience. Samuel rose slowly, gathering his papers and briefcase. As he walked toward the front of the courtroom, he could hear the soft sighs and shuffling of those waiting behind him, their frustration at his measured pace barely concealed. Judge Barrett glanced up from his papers, and a small smirk played across his face as he watched Samuel's approach. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Barrett drawled, leaning back in his chair, "I see you're here concerning a parking violation from last month." His tone was laden with condescension, the kind often reserved for those deemed less worthy of respect. Samuel stood straight despite his years, his dignity evident in his posture. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice clear and steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding the circumstances of that ticket." Judge Barrett exchanged a knowing look with Ms. Peterson, who covered a small smile with her hand. The judge's fingers drummed impatiently on his desk as he glanced at the clock on the wall. "Well, Mr. Richardson, why don't you tell us what possible misunderstanding could there be about a clearly posted no parking sign?" The morning light now streamed directly through the windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Samuel could feel the weight of eyes on him, some impatient, some indifferent, a few sympathetic. But he remained unruffled, reaching into his briefcase with careful deliberation. "Your Honor, if I may," Samuel began, but Judge Barrett cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Mr. Richardson, we have a full docket today," the judge interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Let's try to move this along, shall we? Some of us still have our faculties about us and can process these matters quickly." A few muffled chuckles echoed from the gallery. Miss Peterson pressed her lips together, trying to maintain her professional composure despite her obvious amusement at the judge's remark. The young bailiff standing by the judge's bench shifted uncomfortably, sensing the inappropriate nature of the moment but powerless to intervene. Samuel's expression remained unchanged, his eyes steady as he looked at Judge Barrett. In his long life, he had faced far worse than a condescending judge, and his patience had been forged through decades of experience that none in the courtroom could yet guess at. Judge Barrett leaned forward, his patience wearing thin as Samuel began to organize his papers on the podium. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in the already tense courtroom. "Mr. Richardson," the judge said, tapping his pen against the bench, "the ticket clearly states you were parked in a loading zone on Pine Street for over 2 hours. Do you deny this basic fact?" His tone carried the weariness of someone who had heard every possible excuse. Samuel carefully adjusted his glasses and spoke in his measured voice. Your Honor, if you would allow me to explain the circumstances. Circumstances? Judge Barrett interrupted with a short laugh. The circumstances are quite simple. You parked where you shouldn't have, for longer than you should have. Now, unless you have a very compelling reason why the laws of Atlanta don't apply to you. He left the sentence hanging, inviting more chuckles from the gallery. Ms. Peterson, the clerk, shuffled some papers unnecessarily, using the motion to hide her smirk. She had seen countless defendants try to talk their way out of tickets, and to her, this was just another routine morning in court. Samuel remained composed, though anyone watching closely might have noticed his grip tightening slightly on the edge of the podium. On the day in question, I was performing volunteer work for Meals on Wheels. He began. Oh, how charitable, Judge Barrett cut in sarcastically. But tell me, Mr. Richardson, does being a good Samaritan exempt you from following parking regulations? He looked around the courtroom as if inviting his audience to appreciate his wit. A young public defender sitting in the gallery frowned, uncomfortable with the judge's behavior. She whispered to her colleague, Is this how we treat elderly citizens now? Samuel continued, his voice steady despite the interruptions. Your Honor, I have documentation from the organization, as well as photographs showing. Mr. Richardson, Judge Barrett sighed dramatically. Perhaps in your advanced years, you've forgotten how these proceedings work. This is not a place for long-winded stories about your community service. The fact remains that you broke the law. The bailiff shifted his weight again, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. A few people in the gallery exchanged concerned glances, while others continued to be amused by the judge's performance. Samuel reached into his briefcase once more, his movements deliberate and precise. If the court would indulge me for just a moment. The court has already indulged you for far longer than necessary, Judge Barrett declared, his voice carrying a note of finality. The fine is $150. Pay it at the clerk's office or set up a payment plan if needed. Next case. But Samuel didn't move. He stood his ground, his expression calm but determined. Your Honor, I believe I have the right to present evidence in my defense. The judge's face flushed slightly at this challenge to his authority. Mr. Richardson, are you attempting to lecture me about court procedures? Not at all, Your Honor. Samuel replied quietly. I'm merely exercising my rights as a citizen. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The young public defender had pulled out her phone and was quickly typing something, her eyes widening as she read whatever appeared on her screen. Judge Barrett's irritation was now clearly visible. Very well, he said through gritted teeth. You'll have exactly 2 minutes to present whatever evidence you think will change the obvious outcome of this case. But I warn you, Mr. Richardson, my patience is not unlimited. Samuel nodded graciously and began removing several documents from his briefcase. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled legal documents for decades, though none in the courtroom yet realized the significance of this small detail. Miss Peterson leaned forward slightly, her previous amusement fading as she noticed something different about the way this elderly defendant handled himself. There was a quiet confidence in his movements that seemed at odds with his apparent position. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. In the gallery, more people were paying attention now, sensing that something unusual was unfolding before them. The young public defender was now urgently whispering to her colleagues, her eyes darting between her phone and Samuel. Judge Barrett drummed his fingers on his desk, making a show of checking his watch. But even he couldn't help noticing that something about this situation had shifted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. Samuel placed 3 neatly organized documents on the podium. His first piece of evidence was a letter with the official Meals on Wheels letterhead, complete with timestamps and signatures. The second was a series of photographs showing his car parked next to clearly visible construction work that had covered the regular loading zone signs. The third was a dated receipt from the senior center where he had delivered meals that day. Judge Barrett's eyes narrowed as he watched Samuel arrange the documents with practiced precision. There was something about the methodical way the elderly man handled the paperwork that seemed oddly familiar, but the judge pushed the thought aside. Your Honor, Samuel began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. On the day in question, there was extensive construction work on Pine Street. The regular loading zone signs were temporarily removed. He held up one of the photographs, showing construction barriers and covered signs. The young public defender in the gallery was now frantically texting someone on her phone. Her colleague leaned over, squinting at her screen, and suddenly sat up straight. The whispers between them grew more urgent. Furthermore, Samuel continued, picking up the official letter, "I have here documentation from Meals on Wheels confirming my volunteer schedule. As their designated driver for that route, I was authorized to use loading zones for brief periods while delivering meals to homebound seniors." Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The elderly man's presentation was unexpectedly professional, his arguments clear and well-structured. Miss Peterson had stopped shuffling papers and was listening intently, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of growing uncertainty. "Your Honor," Samuel went on, his voice taking on a subtle but authoritative tone that made several attorneys in the gallery turn their heads. "The City Code, Section 40 to 215, specifically provides exemptions for charitable organizations conducting official business. Meals on Wheels falls under this category." The judge's face flickered with surprise at the specific legal citation. "Mr. Richardson," he interrupted, though with notably less confidence than before, "are you represented by counsel today?" "No, Your Honor," Samuel replied calmly. "I'm quite familiar with the relevant statutes." The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. The young public defender was now showing her phone to others around her, and their eyes widened as they read whatever was on the screen. The information was spreading through the gallery like a quiet wave. Judge Barrett noticed the changing atmosphere but pressed on. "Even if what you say about the construction is true, that doesn't explain the 2-hour duration of your parking." Samuel nodded respectfully. "If you'll examine the third document, Your Honor, you'll see the timestamp receipt from the senior center. Due to the construction delays and a medical emergency with one of our meal recipients, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, we were required to wait for emergency services to arrive before we could complete our deliveries." The bailiff, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened up as recognition dawned on his face. He quickly wrote something on a piece of paper and walked it over to Ms. Peterson, whose eyes grew wide as she read it. "Your Honor," Ms. Peterson interrupted, her voice slightly shaky, "may I approach the bench?" Judge Barrett waved her forward impatiently, still focused on Samuel. As the clerk leaned down to whisper in his ear, the color began to drain from the judge's face. His eyes darted between the note in his hand and the elderly man standing before him. Samuel continued presenting his evidence as if nothing had changed, his demeanor remaining exactly as it had been, professional, dignified, and thoroughly prepared. But now there was something else visible to those watching closely, the supple signs of someone who had spent countless hours on the other side of a courtroom bench. The morning sun had reached its peak, streaming through the high windows and illuminating Samuel's face as he stood at the podium. In that moment, despite his age and worn clothing, he seemed to stand taller, his presence filling the courtroom in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. Judge Barrett sat frozen in his chair, the note from Ms. Peterson crumpled slightly in his tightening grip as the full realization of his morning's behavior began to sink in. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Judge Barrett's earlier confidence had evaporated as he stared at the note in his hand, then back at Samuel. The elderly man stood quietly at the podium, waiting with the patience of someone who had seen countless similar moments from the other side of the bench. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Barrett began, his voice noticeably softer now, "I understand you were previously." He trailed off, uncertain how to proceed. "I was simply presenting my evidence, Your Honor," Samuel replied evenly. "Would you like me to continue?" By now, the whispers had spread throughout the entire courtroom. A senior attorney who had just walked in stopped dead in his tracks, his face showing instant recognition. "My God," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "that's Judge Samuel Richardson." The young public defender who had first made the discovery was now explaining to those around her. He was one of the first black federal judges in Georgia, served for 35 years, wrote the decision in the Thompson civil rights case. He's a legend in the legal community. Judge Barrett's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled the papers on his bench. The same man he had been mocking and dismissing all morning had once occupied a position far more prestigious than his own. Worse still, Samuel Richardson was known throughout the legal community for his fairness, patience, and unwavering respect for everyone who entered his courtroom. Samuel continued with his presentation, maintaining his dignity and focus on the matter at hand. As I was saying, Your Honor, the emergency services report from that day confirms that paramedics were on scene from 10:15 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., attending to Mrs. Thompson. I remained present as the only person who knew her medical history and emergency contacts. Miss Peterson, who had recovered some of her composure, was now treating Samuel with marked deference. She pulled up additional records on her computer, her earlier smugness replaced by professional efficiency. The parking ticket, Samuel continued, was issued at 11:45 a.m., just as I was preparing to leave. The officer who wrote the ticket couldn't have known about the covered signs or the medical emergency. I attempted to explain the situation, but he was understandably focused on completing his rounds. More people had filtered into the courtroom as word spread through the courthouse. Several veteran lawyers stood at the back, watching with great interest as the scene unfolded. Among them was a former clerk who had worked with Samuel during his time on the federal bench. Judge Barrett cleared his throat. Mr. Richardson, that is, the court. He paused, struggling to find the right words. The irony of the situation was palpable. The younger judge who had been so condescending now found himself fumbling for words before the very kind of judicial excellence he should have been exemplifying. Samuel simply waited, his expression neutral. He had seen many such moments during his years on the bench. Moments when pride gave way to humility, when assumptions crumbled in the face of reality. But he showed no sign of satisfaction or vindication. Your evidence appears to be in order, Judge Barrett finally managed to say. The photographs clearly show the construction work, and the emergency services report corroborates your timeline. Furthermore, the Meals on Wheels documentation confirms your authorized volunteer status. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock seemed unusually loud. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant, not just the resolution of a parking ticket, but a powerful lesson in prejudgment and respect. Samuel gathered his documents with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the proceedings. His movements were unhurried, each paper returned to its proper place in his worn briefcase. The simple dignity of his actions served as a stark contrast to the treatment he had received earlier. Judge Barrett watched this process with growing discomfort, acutely aware that every eye in the courtroom was now focused not on the elderly man before him, but on his own reaction to this revelation. The morning's earlier laughter had been replaced by a heavy silence, thick with anticipation of how the current judge would handle this humbling moment. Judge Barrett cleared his throat several times before speaking, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. In light of the evidence presented, this court finds no basis for the parking violation. The ticket is dismissed, Mr. Richardson. But Samuel remained at the podium, his posture straight despite his years. Your Honor, if I may address one final matter? The judge nodded quickly, no longer able to meet the elderly man's steady gaze. The courtroom remained silent, the tension almost palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Throughout my career on the federal bench, Samuel began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, I saw many young judges grappling with the enormous responsibility of their position. It's not an easy role. Several of the veteran lawyers at the back of the courtroom nodded in agreement. One of them, Judge Sarah Martinez, had been a young attorney in Samuel's courtroom 20 years earlier. She remembered how he had mentored countless legal professionals, always leading by example. The hardest lesson I learned, Samuel continued, was that true justice requires us to see the humanity in every person who stands before us. Whether they wear expensive suits or worn clothes, whether they speak with education or simplicity, their right to dignity remains the same. Judge Barrett's face had turned a deep shade of red. The morning's events were playing back in his mind, his mockery, his impatience, his casual dismissal of an elderly man's rights. Each memory now carried the sharp sting of shame. The young public defender who had first recognized Samuel was furiously taking notes. Next to her, a law student intern sat wide-eyed, witnessing a masterclass in judicial temperament and professional ethics. I don't mention this to embarrass anyone, Samuel said gently. Rather, I hope this morning might serve as a reminder of why we have procedures, why we listen to evidence, and why we treat every person in this court with respect. These aren't just noble ideals. They're the foundation of our justice system. Miss Peterson, the clerk, had tears in her eyes. She remembered her own smirks and silent laughter earlier, now feeling the full weight of her unprofessional behavior. A reporter from the local legal newspaper who had slipped in during the proceedings was scribbling rapidly in his notebook. This story would soon spread throughout Atlanta's legal community, though not in the way Samuel would have chosen. Your Honor, Samuel concluded, I thank the court for its time and attention, and if I might make a suggestion, perhaps the next time an elderly person moves slowly in your courtroom, it would be worth remembering that they carry with them a lifetime of experiences we cannot see at first glance. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Barrett seemed to have aged years in the past hour, the weight of his actions visible in his slumped shoulders and troubled expression. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Judge Richardson. Your words, your wisdom. I have no excuse for my behavior this morning. Samuel closed his briefcase with a soft click. No excuse is needed, Your Honor. What matters is what we learn from our experiences. He turned to leave the podium, then paused. And if you're interested, Meals on Wheels is always looking for volunteers. Seeing the city from street level can provide valuable perspective for any judge. As Samuel made his way toward the exit, the crowd parted respectfully. Several attorneys bowed their heads slightly as he passed, a gesture of deep respect in the legal community. The young public defender looked like she wanted to speak to him, but couldn't find the words. Just before reaching the door, Samuel turned back one last time. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught his face, highlighting the quiet strength and dignity that no amount of dismissive treatment had managed to diminish. Judge Barrett watched him go, understanding that he had just received one of the most important lessons of his career, not from a judicial conference or a legal textbook, but from an elderly man in a worn suit who had chosen to teach through example rather than humiliation. By lunchtime, news of the morning's events had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation as court staff, lawyers, and clerks discussed what had transpired in courtroom 3B. Judge Barrett sat alone in his chambers, his untouched sandwich growing stale on his desk. The morning's case calendar had been postponed, officially due to administrative matters, but everyone knew the real reason. The judge needed time to process what had happened. On his computer screen was Judge Samuel Richardson's biography. The more he read, the worse he felt. Richardson had been appointed to the federal bench in 1985, becoming one of the first black federal judges in Georgia. His decisions had helped shape civil rights law in the Southeast. He was known for his brilliant legal mind, but even more for his unwavering commitment to treating everyone with dignity. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called out, his voice lacking its usual authority. Miss Peterson entered, carrying a thick file. Your Honor, I've pulled some records you should see. Her usual efficiency was tinged with embarrassment. Judge Richardson didn't just serve on the federal bench, he was also known for his community service. He's been volunteering with Meals on Wheels for the past 15 years, ever since his retirement. Judge Barrett took the file with trembling hands. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and community service awards. One picture showed Samuel Richardson serving Thanksgiving dinner at a homeless shelter. Another captured him reading to children at the public library. There's more, Ms. Peterson continued. He established a scholarship fund for underprivileged law students. Many of the young attorneys who practice in this courthouse received help from his foundation. The young public defender who had recognized Richardson appeared in the doorway. Judge Barrett, may I have a moment? He nodded, grateful for any distraction from his thoughts. I just got off the phone with my mentor, she said. She clerked for Judge Richardson 20 years ago. She said he used to tell all his clerks, the most important quality in a judge isn't knowledge of the law, it's the ability to see the humanity in every person who enters the courtroom. Judge Barrett stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the street below. He could see the Meals on Wheels van parked in its designated spot, volunteers loading coolers for their afternoon deliveries. Do you know what makes this worse? He said, more to himself than his visitors. He could have humiliated me, he had every right to. Instead, he turned it into a teaching moment. The courthouse security guard appeared next, adding another layer to the story. Judge, you should know, Judge Richardson takes the bus here every morning. He could afford a driver, but he says it helps him stay connected to the community he serves. More people gathered in the doorway of Barrett's chambers, each with their own story about Samuel Richardson. A veteran bailiff remembered how Richardson had paid for his son's law school textbooks. A court reporter recalled him staying late to help her grandfather navigate a complex legal issue. Judge Barrett sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of his morning's behavior. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from other judges and attorneys who had heard about the incident. The chief judge of the municipal court called, her voice stern. "Barrett, we need to talk about implementing some changes. Judge Richardson may have been gracious about this morning's events, but we can't let something like this happen again." As the afternoon wore on, Judge Barrett thought about Samuel Richardson taking the bus home, probably already focused on his next delivery route, his next person to help. The contrast between Richardson's lifetime of service and his own behavior that morning couldn't have been starker. Miss Peterson returned one final time, placing a newspaper from 1985 on his desk. The headline read, "Richardson appointed to federal bench. Promises to treat all with dignity." Below was a quote from his investiture speech. "The true measure of justice is not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we treat those who appear to have no power at all." Judge Barrett stared at the yellowed newspaper, understanding that today's lesson would either make him a better judge or haunt him for the rest of his career. The choice, he realized, was entirely his. 1 week after the incident, Judge Barrett sat in his office early morning, reviewing a letter he had written and rewritten dozens of times. The formal apology to Judge Richardson had gone through countless drafts, each attempt feeling inadequate to address his behavior. The events of that day had already brought significant changes to the courthouse. The chief judge had implemented mandatory sensitivity training for all court personnel. More importantly, Judge Barrett had requested to be mentored by more experienced judges, acknowledging he had much to learn about judicial temperament. As he read through his letter one final time, his phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Peterson. "Judge Richardson is here for his scheduled meeting." Barrett's hands shook slightly as he straightened his robe. He had requested this meeting through proper channels, not sure if the retired judge would accept. To his surprise, Richardson had agreed promptly. Samuel Richardson entered the chambers with the same quiet dignity he had shown the week before. He carried his worn briefcase, but today he also held a small paper bag. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Judge Richardson," Barrett began, standing respectfully. "I know no apology can fully." Samuel raised his hand gently. "William, may I call you William? I didn't come here for apologies. I brought breakfast." He opened the paper bag, revealing 2 fresh bagels. "I find that sharing a meal often makes difficult conversations easier." As they sat down, Samuel continued, "I understand you've requested mentorship from Judge Martinez and Judge Thompson. That shows wisdom." Barrett nodded, touched by the elderly judge's kindness. "The way I treated you was unforgivable. But what haunts me most is knowing how many others I may have treated similarly when they didn't turn out to be retired federal judges." Samuel spread cream cheese on his bagel thoughtfully. "Then you've already learned the most important lesson. Tell me, what changes have you made in your courtroom this past week?" Barrett straightened in his chair. "I've adjusted our scheduling to allow more time for each case. I've instructed Ms. Peterson to provide assistance to anyone who seems confused by court procedures. And I've started arriving early to observe people in the waiting area to better understand their circumstances." "Good starts," Samuel nodded. "But there's something else I'd like you to consider." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a volunteer application form. "Meals on Wheels needs help on Saturdays." Barrett stared at the form, understanding the deeper meaning behind the invitation. "You want me to walk in other people's shoes?" Samuel smiled. "Yes, not as a judge, but as a person serving his community. You'll meet elderly shut-ins, struggling families, people facing challenges you've never imagined. It will change how you see every person who enters your courtroom." The younger judge took the form with trembling hands. "I don't deserve this chance." "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow," Samuel replied. "That's something else I learned in my years on the bench. Now, tell me about your cases this morning. Let's discuss how you might handle them differently." For the next hour, they talked about judicial philosophy, human dignity, and the responsibility of wearing the robe. Samuel shared stories from his decades of experience, not as lectures but as gentle guidance from someone who had walked the path before. As their meeting drew to a close, Samuel packed up his briefcase. "William, do you know why I still volunteer at my age?" Barrett shook his head. "Because it reminds me that behind every case, every file, every number on a docket, there's a human story. When you understand that, you become not just a better judge, but a better person." He stood to leave, then turned back. "I'll see you Saturday morning at the senior center. 6 a.m. sharp. The coffee isn't great, but the company is excellent." After Samuel left, Judge Barrett sat quietly in his chambers, looking at the volunteer form on his desk. Outside his window, the morning sun illuminated the courthouse steps where dozens of people waited for their cases to be called. For the first time in his career, he truly saw them, not as cases to be processed, but as human beings with stories, struggles, and dignity. He picked up his pen and began filling out the volunteer form, understanding that his real education as a judge was just beginning. 6 months later, the Atlanta Municipal Court had undergone a remarkable transformation. The changes weren't visible in the building's architecture or the formal procedures, but in the atmosphere and approach to justice. Judge Barrett stood in the courthouse parking lot early Saturday morning, helping load coolers into the Meals on Wheels van. His judicial robe was replaced by jeans and a volunteer t-shirt, his once perfect hair slightly messy from the early morning humidity. "William, don't forget Mrs. Johnson needs her medication list checked," Samuel called out, reviewing the delivery schedule. At 79 now, he had finally agreed to serve as the route coordinator rather than making deliveries himself, though he still came every weekend to oversee operations. The past 6 months had changed Judge Barrett profoundly. Every Saturday, he drove through Atlanta's neighborhoods, delivering meals and spending time with elderly residents. He learned their stories, understood their struggles, and saw the city through different eyes. In his courtroom, the change was evident. The rushing, the dismissive attitudes, and the impatient sighs had disappeared. Instead, there was patience, understanding, and genuine attention to each case. His colleagues noticed that he took extra time with elderly defendants, often ensuring they understood every aspect of their cases. Miss Peterson, too, had been transformed by the experience. She had joined the volunteer program after seeing the change in Judge Barrett. Now she helped people fill out court forms during her lunch break and had started a program to assist elderly residents with legal paperwork. On this particular morning, as the volunteers gathered for their pre-rope briefing, a local news crew set up their equipment nearby. They were doing a story on the unusual partnership between the municipal court and Meals on Wheels, which had become a model for other cities. "Judge Richardson," the reporter asked, "did you ever imagine that getting a parking ticket would lead to all this?" Samuel smiled, watching Judge Barrett help a new volunteer organize her delivery route. "Justice works in mysterious ways," he replied. "Sometimes it takes a small incident to teach a big lesson." The story had spread through legal circles across the state. Other courts had started implementing similar community service requirements for their judges and staff. The Georgia Bar Association had invited both judges to speak about the importance of humanity in the justice system. But the real impact was visible in the daily operations of the courthouse. The waiting room now had volunteers helping people understand their rights and responsibilities. Signs were clearer, procedures were more patient-friendly, and there was a new emphasis on treating everyone with dignity. Judge Barrett approached Samuel, clipboard in hand. "Route 7 is ready to go. Mrs. Thompson asked specifically about you. She says you still owe her a game of chess." Samuel chuckled. "Tell her I'll be there next week. And William, don't forget about Monday's mentoring session with the new judges." The mentoring program had been Barrett's idea. New judges now spent their first month not just learning procedures, but also working in community service. They called it the Richardson Rule. No one could take the bench without first understanding the community they served. As the volunteers departed in their vehicles, Samuel sat on a bench outside the courthouse, watching the sunrise over Atlanta. He thought about his years on the federal bench, the cases he'd heard, the decisions he'd made. But somehow, this unexpected turn of events, a simple parking ticket leading to profound institutional change, felt like one of his most significant contributions to justice. Judge Barrett's van was the last to leave. He rolled down his window. "See you in court on Monday, Judge Richardson." "Wouldn't miss it," Samuel replied. "Someone has to keep an eye on you young judges." As the van disappeared around the corner, Samuel opened his worn briefcase and pulled out a newspaper clipping from 6 months ago. The headline read, "Judge learns valuable lesson about prejudgment." He smiled and tucked it away again. The courthouse would open in a few hours, and a new group of people would come seeking justice. Thanks to one morning's lesson in humility and the wisdom of an elderly judge, they would find not just legal proceedings, but human understanding. Samuel Richardson stood up slowly, his joints stiff from the morning chill. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. In those shadows, he saw not just the history of justice in Atlanta, but its future, a future where every person, regardless of appearance or age, would be treated with the dignity they deserved.